They cast her aside like broken glass, whispering that she'd never be wanted, never be loved until he rode in, lifted her from the dirt, and called her his bride. In his eyes, she wasn't a burden. She was the beginning of something sacred. They never said it outright, but Ilara knew. In every glance cast over her head, in every chore dumped at her feet, in every townswoman's whispered, pity-laced comment at the trading post, she knew exactly what they thought. Useless. She had been born with a crooked leg after a fever in childhood stole the strength from her bones. That was all it took. One limp, one flaw, one future gone. Now, at 23, while other girls had long since married, birthed children, and moved to farms of their own, Ilara was still scrubbing floors and hanging wet linens for her older brother Nathan and his bitter wife Ruth. She wasn't a daughter anymore, just extra hands they didn't want to admit they needed. They didn't beat her, didn't scream. They just erased her. She took what scraps of freedom she could. When the sun slanted just right and Ruth was busy pickling, Ilara would slip away up to the ridge overlooking the valley. That was the only place she could breathe her sanctuary of silence and sky. There, she'd sit in the grass with a bit of cloth and a blackened stick, sketching whatever the wind gave her, a bent tree, a bird overhead, the way the light spilled between clouds like spilled honey. She never expected company. But that day, something changed. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw them, a low, rhythmic thunder rolling over the ridge, too smooth to be cattle, too many to be a lone traveler. When she looked up, her breath caught. A line of Sioux warriors rode along the horizon, framed by sky and dust, silent, regal, eyes forward. The townspeople feared the Sioux, called them savage, dangerous. Ilara didn't move. She didn't feel fear only awe. Then one of them broke from the group. He was tall, with braided black hair, and the kind of posture that made the wind seem to pause. His horse carried him down the slope, slowly, directly toward her. She could have run, should have. But she stayed. The warrior stopped a few yards away, said nothing. Their eyes met. And in that brief moment, something ancient passed between them. No pity, not curiosity, recognition. He gave a single nod, a slow, deliberate gesture of respect, then turned and rode back to his brothers without a word. That night, Ilara didn't tell anyone, not Nathan, not Ruth. She just lay beneath her thin quilt, listening to the coyotes cry beyond the fields, and felt something she hadn't known in years. Not fear, no shame, hope. If you thought being left behind was painful, wait until you see what comes riding out of the mist. Morning broke heavy with heat, the sky low and gray like a stretched-out bruise. Ilara moved quietly through her chores, her hands going through the motions feeding chickens, hauling water, but her mind was still back on that ridge. On him. She didn't know his name. Didn't even know if he'd really seen her, or if he'd only looked past her like everyone else. But something about that moment stuck to her like wood smoke. It clung to her skin, to her thoughts, refusing to be scrubbed away. By midday, the town was buzzing. Word spread that a group of Sioux had been spotted near the riverbed. The blacksmith was already boarding up his windows. Pastor Evans canceled evening prayer. Nathan came home early, fuming about savages on our land, and sharpening the axe for no good reason. But Ilara knew. He was back. She couldn't explain how she knew, only that she did. So while the rest of town busied themselves with fear and shudders, Ilara climbed the ridge again. Her limp slowed her on the rocky path, but she kept going, breath ragged, skirt catching on brush. And there he was, alone this time, sitting atop a painted horse, still as stone, like he'd been waiting for her all morning. Ilara froze halfway up the slope, one hand gripping a tree for balance. The warrior raised his arm in greeting. Then, without a word, he dismounted. She watched him tie his horse to a low-hanging branch, then approach slowly, as if he knew not to spook her. His presence was quiet, grounded, not at all like the angry men of her town who filled a room with fists and noise. When he finally stood before her, he placed something in her hand. A necklace carved from buffalo bone, strung with rawhide, simple yet precise. A gesture of peace. Ilara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. He nodded once, then turned to leave but paused. His voice, when it came, was deep and calm, thick with an accent but clear enough to understand. "Tokala," he said, tapping his chest. Then he pointed to her. She blinked, then said softly, "Ilara." He gave a small smile, almost imperceptible, then mounted his horse in one fluid motion and disappeared into the trees. She stood there long after he was gone, the necklace clenched tight in her palm, her breath caught between disbelief and something else, something wild, something alive. By morning, the necklace was gone, not lost taken. Ilara had hidden it under her pillow the night before, wrapped carefully in linen. But when she returned from tending the goats at dawn, her bed had been stripped and her belongings tossed. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, arms crossed, jaw tight. Ruth stood behind him, arms full of laundry she hadn't washed. Her eyes were wide with the kind of judgment that doesn't leave room for questions. "You're seeing one of them, aren't you?" Nathan said flatly. Ilara said nothing. She didn't trust her voice not to tremble. He stood, kicking the chair backward as he moved. "You think I don't hear things? You think people don't talk? Said they saw you up on the ridge with an Indian. Said he gave you something." Ruth sniffed, more insulted than scared. "You brought shame into this house, into this family. After all we've done to let you stay." "Let her stay." Ilara's hands curled into fists, but still she said nothing. She didn't cry when Nathan slapped her, didn't blink when he threw the rest of her drawings into the fire. But later, after sundown, when she passed the barn to feed the chickens, her breath caught. A sign had been nailed to the side of the stable in red paint that hadn't yet dried. "Useless and used." The words dripped like blood. Beneath them, hung on a nail like an afterthought, was the buffalo bone necklace split down the center, cracked in two. She stood there a long time, chickens forgotten, her heart pounding like it might shatter her ribs. No one in town would ever ask her what really happened. They didn't want the truth. They just wanted someone to point at, someone to shame so they didn't have to look at their own small, mean lives. And now she has been marked, not with paint, not with words, with exile. The next day, at the general store, no one met her eye. Not the butcher, who once let her keep the extra fat for stew. Not Miss Clara, who'd stitched her a shawl last winter when the frost nearly turned her fingers blue. They turned their backs like she was already gone. But she wasn't. Not yet. That night, she returned to the ridge. No drawing cloth, no charcoal, just silence, just sky. She sat beneath the same twisted cedar, her broken necklace in her lap. The stars blinked overhead like old secrets. And though the wind was still, she whispered into it. "Come back." Far from the ridge and the broken barn sign, the fire crackled within a circle of stone, casting long shadows across painted faces and lean shoulders. Tokala sat just beyond the glow, cross-legged and silent, his gaze fixed on the flames, as if they held an answer he hadn't yet heard. Around him, elders murmured in Lakota, voices low and firm. His uncle, Mato, sat nearest the center, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes sharp as winter wind. "You rode back alone," Mato said, poking the fire with a stick. "You broke formation. For what? A girl?" Tokala didn't respond. Across the fire, a younger warrior scoffed. "A white girl, lame in the leg, who couldn't walk 2 miles without resting. That's who caught your eye?" A few others chuckled, but Tokala's mother, Wiyaka, silenced them with one glance. She hadn't spoken yet, but her presence held weight. She turned to her son, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You saw something in her." Tokala nodded slowly. "She does not flinch. Even when the world turns from her, that is a strength few carry." Mato snorted. "That may be, but strength is not enough. She's an outsider. She has no people here, no name among us." "She has a name with me," Tokala said simply. That made the fire go still. It was Wiyaka who finally spoke again, her voice like wind through pine. There was a vision, long before your birth. A girl with sorrow in her eyes and earth on her hands, cast aside by her own, chosen by the one who walks between tribes. Mato rolled his eyes. Old stories. Old stories keep us alive, Wiaka replied, and sometimes they come true. Tokala stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. I'm not asking permission, he said, though there was no defiance in his tone, just certainty. I am going to her. The fire snapped and hissed as if trying to speak. Behind him, someone muttered, He'll bring shame to his lodge. But Wiaka only smiled faintly. Or he will bring a missing spirit home. That night, while the others slept beneath buffalo hides and pine branches, Tokala prepared for the journey. He gathered no weapons, no war paint, only a carved horn pendant from his pouch and a pouch of cedar bark and sweetgrass. Before dawn touched the horizon, he rode out alone, his horse silent beneath him, his eyes fixed on the ridgeline where twisted trees grew and where one girl had not turned away. The others might call it foolish, but he called it fate. The town hadn't forgotten Ilara's disgrace. If anything, the silence had only grown colder. The children no longer waved when she passed. The pastor didn't nod from his porch. Even the storekeeper's dog, who once trailed her down the lane for scrap snow, growled low when she neared. She kept her eyes down, did her chores without a word, and spoke only when spoken to. But her ears were always turned toward the ridge. 3 days passed, then 4. Then, on the 5th morning, as the sky bled lavender and gold across the eastern fields, the wind changed. She felt it first. Then she heard the hoofbeats. Steady, slow, purposeful. She stepped out of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron, heart pounding so loud she could hardly hear. And there he was, Tokala, riding alone. No war party, no fanfare. Just him and the horse that moved like it had been born of thunder. He dismounted before reaching her, his every movement deliberate, unhurried. The town saw him. They always watched, even when they pretended not to. Doors creaked open, curtains parted. Nathan stepped onto the porch, jaw clenched, fists at his sides. Tokala walked past him without so much as a glance, stopped in front of Ilara, and held out his hand. An Itanu necklace, carved again from buffalo bone. This time, it was shaped like a feather caught in the wind. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her fingers trembled at her sides. This is not for pity, he said softly. It is for honor. Nathan stepped forward. She's not yours. Tokala turned his head, his gaze calm but iron steady. She is not yours either. A hush fell over the yard. Ruth had come outside now, arms folded, lips thin. The pastor watched from a distance. Someone from the store whispered a prayer under his breath. Nathan reached for the axe, resting against the porch. Tokala didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He took one step closer to Ilara, enough for her to smell the leather of his tunic, the sweet grass braided into his hair. She chooses, he said. Not you, not them. And then he did the unthinkable. He knelt, right there, in the dust and chicken feathers, in front of the girl everyone had written off. The Sioux warrior bent his knee not to beg, but to offer. Ilara's heart thundered against her ribs. She looked around at the faces, staring, judging, ready to tear her apart. Then she looked down at him, at the man who saw her, and slowly, her fingers reached for the necklace. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Her choice rang louder than words. She didn't pack much, just a small bundle wrapped in linen, tied tight with fraying twine, a spare dress, a comb, a few sketches she'd hidden from the fire. There was no farewell, no embrace, only silence as she stepped down the creaking porch one last time. Nathan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, the lines on his face deeper than usual. He didn't stop her, didn't look at her either. Behind him, Ruth turned away, not out of grief but shame. Ilara didn't cry. The tears had dried long ago. Tokala waited by the road, his horse saddled, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask if she was sure. She climbed up behind him, her arms unsure at first, barely touching him until the horse began to move and the wind pulled at her skirts. Then, without thinking, she leaned into him, her cheek resting between his shoulder blades, as if she'd always belonged there. They didn't speak on the journey. The land shifted slowly as they rode a prairie giving way to forest, wide skies narrowing between tall pines. The air grew richer, alive with birdsong and the scent of cedar. By nightfall, they reached his people. The village sat nestled in a basin between the hills, ringed with firelight and smoke drifting from hide-covered lodges. Children paused in their games to stare. Elders turned slowly, eyes wary. No one smiled. No one welcomed her. Tokala dismounted first, then offered his hand again. Alara took it, heart thudding. The ground felt different here, warmer somehow, though unfamiliar. Wiyaka, Tokala's mother, approached first. Her long gray braids swayed behind her, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak to Alara, not yet. She touched Tokala's cheek, looked at him hard, then at Alara, and finally said, "She may stay, for now." That was all. No celebration, no embrace. Just space carved out for her near the edge of the campe, small tent made of hide and willow, barely tall enough to stand in, but dry, and hers. She was not a wife yet, not a guest. She was something in between. The next morning, Ilara awoke to the rustle of footsteps outside her tent. A small bundle had been left by the entrance. Fresh bread, a bone comb, a strip of soft rabbit fur. No note, no explanation. But something had shifted. Not in the village, in her. For the first time in her life, Alara felt something take root, not hope, not yet, but possibility. She tied the feather necklace around her neck, let it rest against her collarbone, and stepped into the light. They could stare, they could whisper, let them. She wasn't going back. The days passed slowly at first, marked by long silences and watchful eyes. Alara kept to the edge of the village, doing what she could without being asked, gathering firewood, hauling water, mending torn garments with careful stitches. No one stopped her, but few spoke. Children stared. Women turned their backs. Some of the men pretended not to see her at all. But she didn't expect warmth. Not yet. She worked in quiet determination, her limp dragging behind her like a forgotten chain. At night, she returned to her little tent, lit a candle, and sketched the unfamiliar world around her, the shape of the elders' faces, the delicate beating on a child's moccasins, the way Tokala stood like he was carved from the earth itself. It wasn't hatred she felt from the others. It was something more complicated. Fear, suspicion, and perhaps curiosity. Then the frost came. Winter rolled down from the hills with teeth bared, driving snow across the camp and snapping tree limbs like twigs. The rivers froze, the wind howled through the village, and sickness crept in quietly, as it always did, first in the children's coughs, then in the fevers that made them cry through the night. One evening, as Alara crouched beside the fire near her tent, a scream shattered the stillness. A woman burst from a nearby lodge, cradling a limp child in her arms. Her voice cracked like ice as she cried out for help. Alara dropped everything. She ran, stumbling on the frozen earth, her heart pounding harder than her legs could carry. The boy was burning with fever, his skin like flame, eyes rolling back. The others hovered helplessly. Even Tokala stood frozen. But Alara knew this sickness. She had seen it before when her mother fought to save her brother years ago, before his heart had hardened. Alara turned without a word and bolted back to her tent. She tore through her belongings, fingers numb and clumsy, until she found what she needed: dried yarrow, elderberry, and the last of the salve her mother had taught her to make. She returned to the boy's side, ignoring the murmurs. With slow, steady hands, she began to work, cooling his forehead, whispering soft comforts, spooning her bitter brew into his mouth. Hours passed. The fire dimmed. And finally, the boy's breathing slowed. The fever broke before dawn. The child slept, peacefully. The woman, his mother, fell to her knees, her eyes wide with disbelief and something deeper. Gratitude. Ilara didn't expect thanks. She simply stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and limped back into the cold. But the next morning, someone left a bowl of warm broth at her tent. That afternoon, a girl offered to braid her hair. That evening, when she walked past the main fire, the elders didn't look away. One of Thima's stooped old man with eyes like storm clouds nodded once. "The earth gave you back to us," he said in Lakota, accented English. Ilara said nothing. She only tightened the feather necklace around her throat and sat by the fire without asking permission. She hadn't been accepted, not fully. But for the first time, she was no longer invisible. The snow began to melt in fits and starts, leaving the earth soggy and bruised beneath heavy gray skies. Ilara had found rhythm in the village, now a place just outside the center but no longer on the edge. She helped the elders grind herbs, taught a few curious children how to draw deer with charcoal, and sat beside Tokala at night, neither of them needing many words. She had not forgotten where she came from, but she had stopped looking back. Until the riders came. It was late morning when the warning call rose from the western ridge. A boy spotted them first, 4 riders in worn coats and wide-brimmed hats, galloping fast across the thawing plain. White men, armed. Tokala and the others moved swiftly, forming a perimeter, weapons in hand but lowered. They did not posture. They did not threaten. But they were ready. Ilara stood just outside her tent, heart cold. She recognized one of the horses before she recognized the faces. Nathan. He sat tall in the saddle, his face pale with rage and pride. Behind him rode 3 other men from the Tona deputy's cousin, a preacher's son, and one with eyes that darted like a weasel's. They pulled their horses to a stop at the edge of the village, boots caked in mud, rifles slung across their backs. Nathan didn't look around. He looked straight at her. "Ilara," he called, loud enough for every ear in the village, "we're here to bring you home." The silence that followed was thick and tight. Ilara didn't move, didn't blink. "I'm already home," she said, voice steady. The preacher's son spat into the dirt. "You don't belong here. These people, they're heathens. You were taken. Everyone back home thinks so." "I wasn't taken," she replied. "I chose to come." Nathan's knuckles whitened on the reins. "You've been brainwashed. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." The tension crackled like dry branches underfoot. Tokala stepped forward then, calm as ever, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife not drawing. "Just ready. You come here with weapons," he said evenly, "and call it rescue?" One of the men snorted. "You think we're going to leave a white girl to rot in your camp? Not likely." Ilara took a step forward. Her limp caught the mud, but she didn't stumble. She looked them in the eye. All 4 of them. "I was rotting when I lived among you," she said. "You let me wither, you broke me one quiet day at a time." Her voice grew louder. "But these people, these strangers you call savages, saw me. They let me be more than broken. And you? You came with rifles and rope." Nathan's jaw twitched. "You're shaming your family." "No," she said. "You shamed yourselves." No one moved. The village stood still, not a whisper. Even the wind had quieted. Finally, Tokala raised a hand not to threaten, but to draw a line. "You will leave now, and you will not return." The man looked to Nathan. He hesitated. Then, without another word, he turned his horse. They rode out the same way they came, smaller somehow than when they arrived. The moment they were gone, the village seemed to exhale. Ilara stood alone in the melting snow, breath ragged, heart pounding. Tokala stepped beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Her stand had spoken for them both. Snow still clung to the shaded edges of the hills, but spring was beginning to stir in the land. The village had survived the worst of winter, and now the air smelled of wet pine and thawing earth. Yet, even as the season softened, unease still gripped the people like an old wound that wouldn't fully heal. Though the white raiders had left days ago, their presence had lingered like smoke over the camp. No one said it aloud, but Ilara could feel it in the shift of eyes, the tightening of shoulders when she passed. The question wasn't whether they would return, but whether she belonged. Tokala heard the whispers. So did the elders. At twilight, they called a gathering by the fire, their silhouettes drawn sharp against the deep orange sky. Alara stayed just outside the circle, heart pounding, listening from the shadows. Tokala stood before the council, back straight, voice steady. "She healed our child," said one elder. "She brought no harm. But still the winds stir. The outsiders will return. We must decide now. Do we keep her or send her away?" Tokala's answer came without pause. "You will not cast her out." A few murmurs rose in protest, but he continued. "Fear brought the raiders, but fear also nearly took that boy's life. She ran toward him when others turned away. She gave of herself, not to be accepted, but because she could not ignore pain. Is that not our way?" "She is not of our blood," an older voice argued. "Neither is the river," Tokala answered. "Yet we drink from it." The council fell silent. Then Wiyaka stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Long ago there was a dream," she said, eyes scanning the faces. "A girl cast aside by her own people, with sorrow in her eyes and earth on her hands. The spirit said she would come when we were losing our way, when compassion risked becoming weakness." She turned to Alara, who now stepped into the firelight. "She is that dream." Some elders bowed their heads. One began to hum. Another closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. Tokala looked to Alara. "Will you still walk beside me?" he asked. Not in demand, but in offering. She nodded. "Now more than ever." And with that, the village chose not out of pity or obligation, but out of trust earned, and truth finally seen. That night, Tokala and Alara sat together beneath the stars, their hands joined in quiet defiance of every voice that had ever tried to silence them. The morning sun climbed slowly over the pine hills, draping golden light across the village like a blessing. Mist curled through the trees, soft and pale, like breath from the earth itself. A hush hung in the air, not silence, but a sacred stillness, like even the birds knew something sacred was about to unfold. Alara awoke to the sound of soft footsteps outside her lodge. She rose without needing to be called, already knowing. Today was the day. The elder women entered without a word, bearing gifts in their arms garments of doeskin, beadwork gleaming like dew, feathers gathered from eagle and crane, bones carved with sacred symbols. Wiyaka, her soon-to-be mother-in-law, nodded softly, and the others set to work. They washed her hair in warm cedar water, combing it until it shone like the black river reeds. One girl braided it with sinew and beads. Another painted ochre across Alara's cheeks in slow, reverent strokes. They dressed her in a wedding dress made not with lace, but with strength hand-stitched hide dyed deep earth brown, trimmed with shell, fringe, and feathers that whispered as she walked. No corset, no veil, no pretenses. She looked at her reflection in a bowl of still water. She didn't see the girl who limped through dust with her eyes on the ground. She saw a woman who had walked through shame and found herself on the other side. Outside, the entire village had gathered. A sacred circle had been formed beneath the open sky. Pine boughs framed the clearing. Sage burned from 4 directions, and a fire blazed in the center. Flames dancing like spirits came to witness the moment. Drums began to pulses low, steady, eternal. The sound didn't just echo in her ears, it moved through her bones. Tokala stood near the fire, tall and still, wrapped in a mantle of eagle feathers, his long braids tied back, his face painted in ochre and charcoal. His eyes never left hers as she stepped forward, the women forming a procession behind her. No priest stood between them, no book, no ceremony written by another hand. This was older, deeper. Wiyaka stepped forward first, tying a red cord of woven sinew and bark around Alara and Tokala's joined hands. "This bond," she said, "is made not in blood, but in spirit. May the ancestors honor it. May the winds protect it." An elder stepped forward and placed a sacred buffalo skull at their feet. "The buffalo gives all of itself, flesh, bone, heart. So must you give of yourselves to one another, in service, in silence, in strength. Tokala turned to her, his hand lifting gently to her face. "You are not a burden," he said. "You are the path. I walked blind until I found you." Her throat tightened. Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. Not because she wasn't moved, but because this time there was no grief inside them. Only power. The drums rose faster now. Voices joined theme, a low, melodic chant sung by the elders and warriors. It was a song of union, of honor, of two lives merging into something greater than either alone. When the final verse ended, Tokala reached behind his neck and unfastened his personal talisman, a beadwork piece inlaid with bear claws and shell. He fastened it to the front of her dress. Just before the fire crackled, the eldest of the elders stepped forward, a man nearly blind, with a voice that sounded like rustling leaves. "There was once a vision," he said, "of a woman with sorrow in her eyes and earth on her skin. She would come not from our blood, but would carry the breath of our ancestors. Today, I see her standing here." He raised his hand, not in judgment, but in blessing. "We name her Wiaka Tianka Buffalo Feather, light in the wind, strong in the storm. In you," he whispered, "I see the one the Spirit spoke of." They were declared husband and wife not by decree, but by the circle closing around them. The people touched her shoulders, kissed her cheeks, offered feathers and beads and words she only half understood, but their eyes no longer held suspicion. They held pride. When night fell, the stars came out as if to honor her. The sky was filled with firelight and dancing. Food was passed hand to hand, children played in the shadows, and the air buzzed with song. Ilara sat beside Tokala at the central fire, her hand in his, her gaze lifted not to the past, but to the endless dark sky above. Across the clearing, she saw Wiaka speaking with a group of young women. A girl she had once caught staring at her now approached and asked, shyly, if she might learn how to sketch like Ilara. And far off, just past the fire's edge, beneath the cover of tall pines, Nathan sat on horseback, alone, watching. He wasn't there to reclaim her, not this time. He only watched as his sister, who had once cowered beneath his scorn, stood tall in the center of a people who now called her their own. She saw him, and then she turned away. The wind picked up rustling feathers, ash and memories alike. Tokala leaned close. "You are not the girl I found on the ridge," he said. "No," she replied, her voice calm and full. "I'm the woman you lifted from the dust, and I will never return to the earth unnoticed again." The drums rose one more time. She danced, limp and all. And the village danced with her. They had once called her useless. But tonight, they called her something sacred, a wife, healer, buffalo heart. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.